Hey everybody, what's going on? It's Alexander Williamson, and today we are going to be talking about the secret history living in your aquarium. What do these little adorable panda loaches have to do with anything? Not much of anything. This is just something for you to look at while I tell you a story. A wonderful nerdy fish story. And I'm going to give you a warning now. This goes back, we're going to go all the way to the Victorian era, all the way to the turn of the century and World War I. We're going to talk about fish keeping early on. We're going to talk about how even in World War I, fish were used to save lives. And the main topic today is why we chlorinate our water, how we get it unchlorinated in the hobby, who invented the way that we do that now and before, what people did, and the fact that it was not until the 1980s that we actually had a product such as Stress Coat, Amquel, Prime, you name it, that dechlorinated the water and was marketed towards the aquarist hobby. So let's jump on into this, and we'll also talk about the hazards and also some of the complications of using these chemicals. They are not without their problems, believe it or not. Yeah, there's unintended consequences, believe it. Okay, so if we go all the way back, let's zoom out a little bit here. You can see some of the shrimp and stuff too, and then that way, if you don't want to hear about chlorine for 15 minutes, you can hear about this. This is going to involve a lot of biology, a lot of chemistry and history, and it's kind of one of those facets that we're looking at, a worldwide facet, a history facet, a trivia facet, and it's all stemming from the point of view of the fishbowl. So let's jump right in and talk about water chlorination. So 1860s, 1870s, the world had industrialized in a lot of the Western countries, places like Paris, Berlin, London, New York, Chicago. Cities had become dense, and there had become actual suburbs because there was working middle class people, and people in these dense cities, as these cities existed before that, obviously, but as these cities grew and grew exponentially during that time, water cleanliness was a major problem, and people were getting things like dysentery, cholera, typhoid, and all sorts of other just food poisoning and mold, worms, bad illnesses from the water. So this time period, going into the 1870s, people were really playing with chemicals in Europe, especially in the United States. And they were playing with chemistry and really figuring out the atomic particles of the universe and things like that. And they had boiled down, specifically in Hamburg, Germany, they had been playing with sodium hypochlorite, that is, and found that it killed all of the little worms and, planaria, all the little junk that was making humans sick. So they wanted to put it into water, and they tried to figure out how to put it into water, and for years it kind of eluded them. They were able to get rid of all these bad things, but there were other bad side effects by putting straight chlorine into straight water. So today we use chlorine and chloramine, as well as some other offshoot salts of chlorine, in our drinking water, and that really has changed things for the better in that we don't have other problems. And at the time, it's kind of funny because, it's actually sad, but you had to be careful as a fish keeper because they used higher doses of this stuff. And why is chlorine bad for your fish? Well, I guess we'll just hop in on that, which is that it takes organic cells and it ruptures the cell membrane, which is why it kills bacteria too, but it burns the soft tissues and gentle tissues in fish's eyes, in their mucous membranes, and fish have all that exposed, plus they're breathing it in through their gills, then through their lungs. And it's actually, they found in 1894, it was actually chlorine gas that they figured out needed to be put into the water. So That's what worked for humans, and in the first town in 1897 implemented it in Maidstone, England, and they actually chlorinated an entire town, got rid of a cholera outbreak, and it was heralded as an amazing feat. People were able to drink the water straight out of the tap, which up to that point was kind of unthinkable unless you had a private well of like artesian well water or something like that. So moving on, they start playing with this and implementing it in various cities. In 1911, they added chloride of lime, so they made this quicklime water, and they used chlorine gas, and they'd run it through a gas, basically a diffuser. They'd run the water through a diffuser, get the chlorine into the water in gas form, and that would allow it to travel down the pipes long enough to not just sit out as a debris in the water and not just evaporate immediately, especially when it's in pipes. One of the problems of the time, though, was all the pipes were either lead or copper, pretty much, and that lead was eroded by the levels of chlorine and other chemicals they were playing with at the time. So lead poisoning in your fish tank, also copper, things like that being etched out, eroded by either basic or acidic, in some cases, substances that they were playing with at the turn of the century, ended up being not always the best, even if humans could consume it. Aquarists noted that you could not use that water, and so the call went up for trying to find ways to dechlorinate. So early on, and surprisingly until very, very late, and I'm talking 1970s and 80s, the common way to do it was to get your tap water, boil it, or to get your tap water, leave it in a tub, and allow the chlorine for 24 to 48 hours to off-gas. And agitation of the water surface was key to making it go faster, but even without that, 24 to 48 hours seemed to be fine. So, back to the use of the chlorine gas and the quicklime. So, Dr. Alexander Cruikshank, he was a first guy in the U.S., and he implemented in New Jersey, in Jersey City, and Atlantic City, because they were tourist traps, basically, and he didn't want people to come in and say, you know, I got food poisoning, the water's bad there. People actually were, you know, it was a big party area for all of New York and the metro area for holidays and things. And so they actually found that 0.2 parts per million to 0.35 parts per million were sufficient to kill bacteria and most of the like little pathogens that you would get, including worms and protists and things like that. So they figured that out. That made it much safer. It eroded all their lead holding areas a lot less. And they also figured out that they could take linen bags and infuse these chemicals in the linen bags. During wartime, they actually, World War I, they would have these linen bags with that and magnesium permanganate also they used, as well as iodine and a number of other substances, but they would either have tablets or infused cloths or filters where you could drink the water. Now, this would not cut it for fish. All these things have unintended consequences for fish. So, the later usage of these tablets and things for humans, once they had it figured out for municipal supplies, you couldn't just plop those tablets in your fish tank for most fish. Some fish were an exception, paradise fish, goldfish, some of them would sometimes survive it. So what they ended up doing is they ended up using these fish when they realized, man, they die really quickly when exposed to this. They actually had goldfish in World War I and cautiously in World War II, but mostly World War I. They had goldfish in the trenches. So when the gas started flying, and this is terrible stuff like mustard gas, chlorine gas was one of the simpler forms of gas, but they had a hard time delivering it. But it was odorless, and it was, you couldn't see it, and it would come at night. And they lobbed these canisters that were basically spraying atomized gas or burning chemicals that hurt, you know, your lungs and everything, you would be in trouble if you took a breathful. And so, sitting low in the trenches, they would have both birds and fish. And fish are very sensitive to, as you know, ammonia and chlorine. So any gases with those elements would settle on the water and thus kill the goldfish quickly. And that was a first sign that sometimes gave them up to a 10-minute head warning that the gas had been cracked and was slowly trickling into the trenches, filling. So interesting cross section of using that. So as I said, the chlorine kills by oxidation. So organic molecules dissolve in the form in the presence of chlorine. So the products that happen. So when chlorine is in water, even in our water today, as it's been gassed into the water, it creates byproducts of bromoform and dibromochloromethane, which causes slowed liver function, slow brain function. It also can cause liver, kidney cancer, as well as heart disease and other organ failure. So they moved away from using high amounts. As I said, they figured out the lower amounts, but they moved away from using straight chlorine gas in the water because over time it could build up. And in fish, it killed your fish like there was no tomorrow very quickly throughout the first half of the 20th century. So later on, they came up with dechlorinators, and some of the first ones were sodium thiosulfate, that's Na2S2O3, and that was used originally to develop film and to cure cyanide poisoning. So that was also used on skin to treat ringworm, skin infections, fungal infections, athlete's foot, things like that. And also they found that later on it helps chemotherapy. So these are the side chemicals produced when chlorine is in the water interacting with organic matter. Also, it's used in gold extraction. It's used to clean the carbon off the gold, and it removes the bromine off the gold when they've used chlorine and also arsenic and other more poisonous things like mercury and things like that, where they fuse together metals in order to later decant or extract them out. So also it's made, the way it's made, the sodium thiosulfate, which is a dechlorinator, it is made as a byproduct of making yellow dyes, and it turns sulfur and sulfur dioxide into these salt compounds. Now these salt compounds, like these, all these brands you know and love, Prime, Amquel, all that kind of stuff, they're all very similar in that the chlorine, pretend that log is the chlorine molecule. Well, these things, they basically form a wall around it by bonding to it, ionic bonding to that, and then for 48 hours, the stuff floats around, and that chlorine is not free and able to start rampaging against biological cells, be it in the gills of the fish or in you. However, as that breaks down and those pieces break off, you get that those side effects, or the the things like the bromosulfate and things like that that have other problems like slowing your brain and liver failure and so forth. So in fish and in plants, that can actually have some metabolic issues. Fish don't need to be the wittiest things in the world, but it can cause cancer, lesions, and other things like that if you use too much of it. So you don't want to be overdosing this stuff all the time. Now you can overdose it if you have an ammonia spike, because ammonia and chlorine are very similar, and they react very similar to these different sulfur compounds. And all these companies have basically taken different sulfate or salts of sulfur, and they have put a little twist on it. They'll add, I don't know, carbon, or they'll add oxygen to something. And that way it's a little different than the other companies, but it's doing the same thing. It's surrounding those atoms. I am filming this tank today because these are Hillstream panda loaches, and they need extremely clean water, low TDS, And I don't like to even use Dechlorinator. In fact, it turns out that people like Gary Lang have been doing research and finding that Dechlorinator, as great as it is, that it allows us to quickly make our tanks safe, it actually has the unintended consequence as well of it creates a crust around eggs. It makes them cell walls around the egg, the membranes, very hard in both shrimp and specifically he was studying rainbow fish. And so those babies are not able to breach the egg wall, the membrane, and thus they get stuck in there and they often die. So do not overchlorinate when you're expecting a batch of youngins in your tank. That's just one of the reasons why I'm showing you guys this shrimp and loach tank. Also, loaches eat things down on the floor. They eat a lot of leftover detritus and algae, and that is a place, lower on the ecosystem. You start to build up things like heavy metals, like the bromo, sulfites, and things like that, where it can build up and become a toxin in their little bellies. And they are adorable, cute little bellies, I have to say. I love these fish. Okay, so let's talk about the first guy to invent this stuff. Now we are using monochloramine. We like to use different compounds like that, but they last longer. And that's partly why we use them, is they last longer. But it's kind of a problem for fish and to get it out of the water. So when the chlorine gets surrounded by this stuff, it is then treated as ammonia, and then your beneficial bacteria can actually eat it for 48 hours. Now, an unintended consequence also is if you do a dip test strip or an API style beaker test, you are going to come up with no nitrates, no nitrites in your tank quite often when you've just used a large amount of Prime or Amqual, any sort of dechlorinator, and that's because it's bound up. It's not useful at the time, and your bacteria is going to try to eat it, but after 48 hours, those nitrates and things, they will reappear. They break away from the bonds, even though the chlorine and ammonia bonds are irreversible, and they become these bigger particles that are not able to dock with smaller cell membrane chemicals and atoms, and then cause compounds and molecules that will rip apart things, basically. So the negative chlorine ions break off, and then they harmlessly evaporate. They leave things like salt, ammonia, water, and it's no big deal. So then we've got products like Stress Coat, and that has things like aloe vera in it. It has things to quell the burns and the side effects that come with chlorine being in the water. And also, some of these sulfite salts can also bond with other chemicals in the water, including heavier chemicals, which you may want in your water in trace amounts. You need trace amounts of magnesium, even copper, even with shrimp. And so you don't always want something that strips the water of a lot of its trace amounts if they weren't in a large amount anyhow. So in any case, in 1963, they came up with some chlorine tablets for the aquariums, and they just weren't the best. And it's not until 1979, 1980 that John Farrell Kunz came up with the true, his first brand was called Chloram-X, so chlorine ammonia X, so X as in getting rid of it. So before that, you had to use electrolytes, salts, and conditioners for water. You could use saltwater conditioner in the freshwater aquarium keeping. And actually, John Farrell Kunz was the guy who came up with, in the 1960s, he came up with Lake Malawi electrolytes, salts, and nutrients, and Lake Tanganyika for cichlids. So what he did there was he actually came up with a way to mimic the chemical profile of what you would see in those cichlid lakes. And he was working for a large constituent company out of Kansas City he was able to keep a third of the company's money there, and he used sodium hydroxymethane sulfonate as his go-to choice early on. But it broke down into quite a bit of sulfur, and so he wanted to find more sulfur salts. Later on, he created, it was called Novaqua and Amquel, as well as Polyaqua, and he licensed that out under companies like Corden. And all of that research was done at the General Drug and Chemical Company of Kansas City. And then his own proprietary patent, he tweaked some things that were proprietary in that we don't know what that means. And he had the Chloramex, as I mentioned, which was a dry powder you would add to water. Later on, they came up with, by the mid-'80s, they came up with liquid suspensions of this, and they had to add various chemicals to keep it active but yet suspended. It neutralizes the ammonia and nitrates for 2 days, and then that allows your beneficial bacteria to eat it up. However, you can also starve your beneficial bacteria, and even that quickly, these bacteria, which have quick life cycles, can run into some trouble when that happens. So you don't want to use a ton of it, and you don't want to do a ton of water changes using it every day. If you've got lots of plants and delicate animals, you may want to look into a reverse osmosis system, or allowing some of your water to be evaporated or collected rainwater, yada yada. There's lots of ways to do it. Now, the biggest thing that I think, other than the false positives that can happen, is also when you buy the bacteria like Colony or Fresh Start or Easy Start, you know, all the different bottled bacterias that are offered now. When you buy that stuff, this dechlorinator can actually cause problems in that it gets rid of that ammonia and some of the other compounds which those bacteria want to eat. So that's an issue. And at times you can kind of half start or false start your cycle. And remember, when you use those, you are not cycling your tank. Your tank is not cycled when you use those. Your tank is safe, but the full palette of all the hundreds of different types of bacteria, and the 2 nitrifying bacteria in particular that we like to use in the hobby, the 2 are very present. However, the flora and fauna that appear if you just do a surface swab, nowhere near the complexity. The last thing that I wanted to say is that it can also drop your pH low, which also means that if you don't have a TDS that's fairly high, so total dissolved solids, if your GH and KH are not, like your calcium and your carbon is not floating around the water to buffer that, to stop it from becoming acidic, it can cause your water to become fairly acidic, up to a point and a half on the scale change, which could really do in for, you know, crystal shrimp and things like that. One more thing that we're doing a lot of research on right now, throughout the hobby, lots of different people are looking at it, is the impact that, so ammonia is a pheromone, and, you know, you make it when you urinate, you make it when you sweat, and in a lot of animals, it is a marker, it is a sign, and there'll be other chemical compounds attached to it. Pheromones you may think of as love and the smell, the musk of that's unique to a species or an individual, and it helps individuals differentiate between how closely related they are to one another. For instance, in tests done in the 1990s, that was found that humans dislike the smell of their siblings far more than people who were genetically different from them. So fish, same deal. It throws off their ability to avoid inbreeding, which a lot of fish are line bred and inbred anyways, so maybe you don't sweat it. But that's an interesting thing also for trying to breed these fish, is what are you doing by putting those extra things in the water and the extra compounds? There's not a great alternative right now, but there is room for improvement. And right now, I recommend the most using Prime, because Prime treats 4,000 gallons in this little bottle. It's the same as everything else, and for me, I like to separate. I don't need aloe vera and all that stuff. If I want aloe vera and what else do they say is in here? You know, I don't know, replacing slime coats, blah blah blah. It's just the same thing as everything else, but they add things into it that make humans think that sounds good. And aloe vera is good, tannins are good for your fish, but I want to be able to control those factors independently, those variables. So as well as the pheromones. No good solution at the moment other than an RO system or distilled water, you know. So that is the history from the World War I trenches and Victoria era keepers of fish finding out that as soon as they chlorinated the water, their fish died and they became suspicious of the process. All the way up to now, and John Farrell Kunz in 1980 down in Kansas City inventing the dechlorinator in a bottle. So if you like these nerdy stories, if you like you know, the history, the background, getting a little off track from fish but hoping to tie it back in, please like, subscribe, feel free to donate to my Kickstarter, not my Kickstarter, no, not a Kickstarter, sorry guys, to my Patreon page. All that's linked below. And if you're looking for any of these fish, shrimp, a lot of these plants, I've also got links and discounts listed below. Going all month, we've got a Christmas in July giveaway and sale with Aquatic Arts, thanks to them who've stocked these tanks. All right, guys, take it easy. I will talk to you later. I hope you're doing great. Take care of yourselves, your fish, and that will take care of everyone. We'll all be doing better in the long run. So swim on and take care. Talk to you next time. Bye.